Hey everyone, Drew here, and welcome back to Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020. Today we're back in the Diamond DA62 with a different purpose than we were last time. However, we're actually going to be taking a look at the Garmin G1000, which is our gorgeous glass cockpit in this aircraft. Now, I've used that term before in a previous video, and I didn't really explain it then, and I'm going to take that time to explain that now. Like, glass cockpit, what does that even mean? Besides, obviously, that somehow glass is evidently involved. Well, modern aircraft are like minor fire aircraft, civilian aircraft are also basically flying computers, right? You've got lots of information on board, things like onboard radar, digital radios, and all that kind of jazz. And so with a modern glass cockpit, which this is a glass cockpit, you get so much more information than a traditional steam gauge cockpit, and that's the old style of stuff, which we don't actually have any steam gauges in this aircraft. I guess our meter down here on the right is the closest thing we have to a steam gauge. These are analogous to steam gauges, being small, like a small ADI and small airspeed and altitude indicator. Those would normally be separate dials, like if you're more familiar with older aircraft with, say, something like the F-86 Sabre. That aircraft has nothing but steam gauges, right? There's no real HUD functionality. You've got a holographic gun sight, but beyond that, everything else is displayed at you through various instrument dials and gauges on the dash. So that's the difference between a glass cockpit and a steam gauge cockpit. With this thing, we've got basically all of the information that the aircraft wants to give us at any given time, readily available and easily readable in the format of these digital displays. So like on the left, we have our PFD, or Pilot's Flight Display, and on the right, we have our MFD, or Map, or Multifunction Display. I was going to call it Map Function Display, but Multifunction Display. Very similar to the A10C Warthog, being it has two multifunction displays, MFDs, and then the Hornet has three. There's two on the left and then one center on the bottom, which I don't think I've actually looked at those in DCS yet on the channel, but we'll get to those. So a glass cockpit gives us all sorts of information, like a heads-up display almost, right? So taking a look at the pilot's flight device, we can see that we've got an aircraft attitude indicator. We've got definitely, that's our datum right there with the indication of where the aircraft is pointing, where our wings are leveled at. Pitch ladder, bank angle indicator. This is definitely an HSI with our heading indicator, desired course, our heading select right there, which of course if I change with that little knob, we can see that, don't want to zoom out, we can see that changes there. Right? Instead of having lots of little different gauges we have to look around at, we got everything nice and central, easy to read. Right? At the top we have information like our radios. These are for navigation, obviously, Nav 1, Nav 2. Over here we have our COM 1 and COM 2. In the center, this is our Autopilot display information, and above that is navigational repeat information, things like distance and bearing for our desired current course. And you're probably going, well, how the hell do you control this? Obviously, with all the knobs and stuff, but what do they all do? They're fairly self-explanatory, but you kind of have to figure out how they function in this aircraft and how Garmin has kind of laid everything out. Such as these bigger knobs down here. Initially, I was somewhat confused. They are actually two tiers. There's a larger outside knob and then a smaller inner knob. And they control different elements of, say, so this is an altitude control. The outer knob will control by the thousands. The inner knob controls by the hundreds. Right, and up here we have nav information that changes our different frequencies for the standby frequency, which then can be swapped using the swap arrows. And over that we've got nav audio level. Below that, like I said before, is our heading bug adjustment, and that heading bug is that little blue dial down there that if we click, realigns itself to our currently aligned heading, which is 235 degrees. I've already mentioned that this is an HSI, which is horizontal situation indicator. A little bit of pilot lingo. It's basically our top-down representation of where so that's our aircraft in the middle. East-west, we're currently facing 235. And this VOR here, that's currently trying to align to whatever nav radio, which is not actually the nav radio here. So it's got nothing. But if I were to change that with our display function down here, we can change that by going CDI, and that changes to GPS, which we have no course set, so that's also got nothing for us either. Moving down and across the bottom here, we've got different functions on this display that we can do things like changing this insert map, which I actually kind of take that off when I'm generally flying unless I'm landing. I like to use it as like an extra positional indicator just for reference. But you can take that guy off and change different functions within it if you wanted. You can change your transponder codes with that button there, which we will go on. And then let's take a look at all these controls on the right, because that's where a lot of the meat and potatoes of this display function control comes in. Up at the top, we've got our COM audio level. That's obviously for our communications radios. The swap function, much like our nav radio, we've got a two-tiered COM toggle switch here, and that'll change our radio inners, outer, or rather the outer big knob changes the big number, little inner knob changes the smaller number after that decimal there. Right, and then you can swap back and forth. Moving below that, we've got our course line, and this will actually toggle between which radio there. Sorry, I didn't mention that. You can click this. Same with the nav. I forgot to mention that. You can click that so you change between which nav radio you are using. Down here we have our CRS and Barrow. What does that mean? Well, CRS is saying our desired course line. So we can change whatever course. See if it changes down there. That doesn't want to. Oh, I guess because we don't have a VOR set. But this will change our barometric pressure. So when air traffic control, I'm going to zoom in a little here, gives you a new setting, you can manually adjust that barometric pressure with that knob there. But I like to just tap B and have it set with that. Down below that, we have our range control. Now that would actually be for this map down here, that if you give it a click, I'm not a fan of this, by the way, Microsoft. Change this shit. This is not good. But you can go ahead with the up-down arrow like that to change the mouse. And that's how you would scroll around that little tiny map down there. But if you want to center back on your plane, you just give that a tap and it will recenter. Down below that, we have our menu controls for various functions on this display, such as our direct to function for navigation, our actual flight plan if we had one loaded, procedures such as loading the approach, arrival, and departure procedures for IFR flight. And then we have our enter and accept buttons down there. Or clear buttons, rather. Below that, we have our navigational knobs. That was how you navigate these menus. Again, with the zoom function there. Sometimes don't necessarily want to zoom. It doesn't quite make the button. But yeah, that's how you change those things around. And then down here, we have our comms, or up at the top again, I should say. So you, of course, select your COM 1, COM 2, and all that good jazz. Which, actually, I don't have our Avionics Master on. Let's go ahead and turn Avionics Master arm. And there we go. So now we can select what radio we're using, which now we got COM 1. Below that, if we had real passengers, you'd use your PA address, turn speakers on, all that kind of jazz. You can mute DME and navigational audio just from here. These really aren't used. Copilot, not. Reduce pilot volume. Increase, blah, blah, blah. What else we got? So here we go. Let's talk about this panel then. So on the right-hand side is the MFD. Now the MFD is our main moving map and also has all of our instrument gauge displays. We also get a repeat of our communications and navigational radio information and our GPS information at the top here for track. Map navigation is our currently displayed mode, which just has different modes we'll talk about in a second. And it'll give you a representation. Like right there, we can see another aircraft is flying off of the airport. We're at London Airport today, local to Ontario. And we can see the different navigational stations that are around the airport. Moving over to the instrumentation, we can see the load or throttle level of our aircraft. The more I move the throttle, the higher that load goes. Pretty self-explanatory. I showed this in that general tour video, but we do have our RPM indicator there, which we're running a little high today, around 725 RPM. Below that, we have our oil temperature, pressure, and coolant temps, fuel temperature, and then, of course, our fuel quantity in gallons. This is a pretty light aircraft. At idle, we're only sipping 0.4 gallons an hour. Now let's go ahead. And what other functions would this I can't speak words display have for us? You're probably wondering. Well, I'm so glad you asked. Besides, and one other thing before we go into other modes, in the map mode, this range, when you scroll on that knob in and out, that's how you adjust the actual zoom in nature of your map. Alright, so let's talk about this guy, the Navigate MFD. So if we give that a click, we'll get to something like our waypoint airport information, which if you were to go ahead and enter an airport, it would give you all the local information for it. You can have your comm configuration, channel spacings. Not that you really need to in the simulator. And then we have a list of all of our current nearest airports. Pretty handy. And then back to our navigation map. Now up here in the right, you'll notice that we got our wind direction, 9 knots. Heading in, oh, what is that bearing off the top of my skull? I don't know. That's going west. There you go. 9 degrees, or 9 knots. But say I don't necessarily need to look at that display, flight display. Let's go on, go ahead and look at this guy for a moment, and we'll see that we have a little extra function with this PFD where we can get some extra information just around our HSI, such as navigational bearing information, either through nav radio or GPS. If you have your navigational radio tuned into the DME at the airport that you're landing at for ILS purposes, which is Instrument Landing System, then that would give you that appropriate information. And of course, we also have wind information, which comes in 3 flavors. This kind of coordinate XY version, which I'm not a fan of, that same directional arrow we saw on the right-hand display, and then my personal favorite, option 3, which actually gives us the bearing, which is 24 degrees, 9 knots. Thank you very kindly. Now, this also has an onboard weather radar. What? Such a tiny aircraft has an onboard weather radar? Yes. Yes, it does. Let's pop back over to the MFD, and we can change to look at that by clicking on this map display, and there you have, we have weather mode now. And we can change that back if we go back to display, like that. But say we need to get some weather information, so let's pop weather, sorry, that's not our weather information, my bad. I want GPS NexRad. That gives us weather information, which is clear skies right now, so there's really not a whole lot going on. There you go. There's a little bit of rain up in the north there, and this is a delay, so don't rely on NexRad to necessarily give you accurate storm information, but it'll give you a reasonable picture. And there's our topographical, which shows you actually the relief terrain around cities and airports. Going back to this display, we've got 2 ways of actually doing this. This is our horizontal, 5, 10, 15, 20 nautical miles, which we can scale out up to 200, which is pretty handy, with light, medium, and heavy for precipitation. And looking at that, we can also get a vertical picture, where this is also really handy. So if you know, now we know how wide it is, well, let's figure out how deep the storm is, and then we can do the same thing all the way up to, again, 200 nautical miles. Super handy. So you can see why people might want a device like this, you know? It changes the way you fly. It makes it exceptionally easy to get information, makes it easy to navigate. Obviously, an aircraft like this has an autopilot, which we can activate with these buttons. I didn't talk about these, which we'll talk about, I guess, in a more detailed autopilot tutorial, but I guess we'll briefly talk about them. So I mentioned we have this altitude select button over here, and we have a repeat, of course, right here. Then we have all these various buttons here, which includes our autopilot engage, our flight director, which actually is not what you probably think it is. It's just a pair of guidelines that ghost around your aircraft atom, showing you where you should be going if you didn't, say, want the autopilot engaged, but are still trying to fly, you know, ILS or whatever. Here we can just have it hold a heading, hold a specific altitude, follow our currently selected navigational mode, be it GPS or a navigational radio station. And we also have our back course mode, which is good for, say, if you were doing a go-around kind of thing. Approach mode, which tells the aircraft, hey, we're trying to get to the landing zone now, so let's just start descending to the runway. Vertical navigation mode, which I believe is a similar function but more for cruise purposes. Somebody can correct me. I haven't really looked into VNV yet. And then down here we have VS and FLC, which stands for flight level change, and VS standing for vertical speed. So what are these used for? If this is a vertical navigation mode, well, these are the more traditional ways of changing your altitude in flight. You know, an air traffic controller is going to give you a new flight level, say 10,000 feet, and you're at 5,000. Well, you would select 5,000 on your altitude knob, and then say hit vertical speed and go 1,000 feet per minute. Or if you didn't want to necessarily have to monitor your throttle as much for a vertical speed, you weren't aiming for a specific number for climb or descent, you can go flight level change, and then that will hold a specific speed in terms of your knots. So if you're doing 105 knots, it's going to do its best to keep 105 knots, and then using your throttle, adjust the pitch of the aircraft to maintain a climb and go up that way. So it's good if you're doing like a cruise climb, for example. And I think that pretty much ramps up most of the features. We can get into a deeper autopilot discussion at a later date, I think. Beyond that really does sum up the G1000 and its basic functions. You can, of course, do all of your mission and waypoint planning through procedures and flight plan. You can manually add all that information yourself. This aircraft, because it doesn't have the keyboard inputs of like its larger cousins, like stuff like the G3000 or whatever's in that Learjet, I think that's a CRJ, it's kind of a pain in the ass to load flight plan information into this. In reality, that's what these SD cards here are for. You would actually do all your flight planning information likely ahead of time, save the flight plan, and then load it into the Garmin. But I could be wrong about that. If I'm wrong about that, you guys are, of course, free to correct me. That's what we do. We learn here together. And you, of course, here you go. Here's some of the other information you get. This is, again, why we really love glass cockpits. Without having to go to my nav, I can get a quick nearest airport, and I can get all my references. Things like my rotation speed, if I have it pre-planned up and done out correctly for minimums, glide rates, whatever, I'm not sure what VX is, my best climb rates, things like that, right? Lots of information. I can put all that on my display HUD. Very easy and simple to use, and just fantastic. But
engaging autopilot.
There you go, turn the autopilot off and all that jazz. Hope that was helpful, guys, and beneficial to you. I certainly enjoyed going through the cockpit today, and we'll see you guys in the next video. Thanks, have a good one. Bye-bye.